This video is for Rob. I was asked how to use a waveform monitor, and obviously this is a very specialized tool. It's like an oscilloscope used to get the correct exposure, usually in cinematography or other quality professional productions. Before going deep into details, just few basic things about exposure in general. As I said before, exposure is not brightness. Exposure is the right amount of light that should fall on your sensor. And obviously the right amount of light will vary with the gamma curve that you're going to use and with the sensitivity of your sensor. Not all cameras are equal, unfortunately. Again, going back to basics, just as a short reminder, to control the exposure, that means the right amount of light that should fall on your sensor, you can alter the aperture, the shutter speed, the gain, or you can put an ND filter in front of a lens, which is essentially a very dark glass that will cut down the light that will fall on your sensor, and unfortunately can also bring a color cast or other chromatic aberrations. Now, in practical terms, in cinematography, you're not going to alter the shutter speed. This should be the double of the frame rate of your project. So we are in a PAL area. If you shoot at 25 frames per second to avoid flickering in the artificial light, your shutter speed, according to the 180-degree rule, should be 1/50 of a second. And this will be locked. You're not going to change it. You're not going to adjust the exposure using the shutter speed. Another part of the triangle of the exposure is the ISO, or the gain. Well, most of the camera, they have one single gain circuit, and they offer the best dynamic range at the base ISO or at the zero gain. So again, this is not something that you want to alter. You're simply going to set the gain at 0 and leave it there. So we are essentially left with the aperture to control the amount of light that will hit the sensor. The aperture is the opening in the lens, and that can be adjusted with a ring or digitally, so the light will enter in a much or less degree of amount on your sensor. Now, to alter the aperture, this is basically how you control the exposure in practical terms. But then again, another phenomenon will happen, and that is the depth of field will be different. So if you shoot at very wide aperture, which are considered 1.4 to 2.8, maybe f4, that will give you a shallow depth of field. That means the subject will be sharp, and behind and in front of him there will be a very blurred background or foreground. Now, what happens is this should be an artistic decision. Initially, you should choose a certain aperture from the artistic point of view. So, luckily, in film world, we are happy to have the fourth element to control the exposure, and that's the ND filter, which is essentially a piece of dark glass that you put in front of the lens. And if you have a variable ND filter, which means that this piece of glass can spin over different strengths, ultimately this is how you going to control the amount of light that falls on your sensor after you have settled a certain working aperture. Now, a very rookie mistake, and everybody is doing that at some stage, is to meter a scene with your own eyes. Unfortunately, cameras are no match for our eyes and brain. So what we are seeing with our eyes sometimes cannot be replicated by simply turning on the camera and pressing the record button. That's not how it works. So when you are in front of a very beautiful light, dim lit scene like this one that is here in my so-called studio, which is actually my bedroom, if you try to capture this with a regular camera in automatic mode, the amount of light that will hit the sensor will be too much. The camera will try to make things very, very bright, and it will simply lose the whole mood that you are seeing with your own eyes when you are inside this bedroom. So first of all, you have to take the manual control of your camera, and this is a very important step, and learning how to use the manual mode. That means you cannot let the camera decide for you. Second of all, you need specialized tool to understand how much light can fall on your sensor based on the sensitivity of your sensor, the specificity of your camera, and based on the gamma curve that you have chosen. As a basic example, a camera out of the box will be set to Rec 709, which is the common gamma curve that you can see in televisions and in display and regular computer displays, and this gamma curve offers 6 or 7 stops of light. But most of the scene, especially those shot in natural light, are far exceeding this. Maybe they have 10 or 12 or 13 or even more stops of light. So that's why when you're in front of a beautiful sunset and you try to capture that with your camera, either the sky is correctly exposed and the foreground is completely dark, or the vice versa. The foreground will be very bright or correctly exposed and the sky is completely blown out. So apparently you cannot have everything. Well, if you shoot in this gamma curve, you're going to change the gamma curve with a log or a raw codec, then the latitude of your sensor may increase if your camera offers you this possibility. So this is another way of controlling ultimately the exposure. You can change the gamma curve to something more flat, which is called log gamma curve, or if you're lucky, you have a camera that can shoot raw. But nevertheless, you need specialized tools to tell you that. The basic tool that have been in every digital camera since the beginning is called Zebra, and this is the tool that we have unfortunately learned how to use in film school as well, but we were not told the whole story. Like the way we were told in film school was to place a piece of white paper in front of your subject, and if you have your camera set to a log gamma curve, if you shot with the Sony or you shot with your Canon, I don't know which camera have you used, but ultimately each gamma curve will have a special IRE value for 90% white reflective, which is essentially a piece of white paper. So if you shoot with a Sony camera in log, you want your Zebra to hit 61 IRE. So you're going to adjust the aperture or hopefully the ND filter until you're going to have a Zebra pattern over the paper that will show you that you are exposing it correctly at 61 IRE. This is a value that has been established by the camera manufacturers. You have to check with the camera manual. You cannot change it. You cannot set yourself a random value. This is something that has been established when the camera has been constructed, so you have to check with the manual. Each log gamma curve for every manufacturer usually will have a different value. I don't know why, but that's the reality, and you have to obey that. It's not something that you can simply establish by your own liking. You have to use the proper value that it is in the camera manual. So there's nothing wrong with this method, this very rudimentary and barbaric method of using the exposure, but this is something that happens usually in the news environment, maybe in the TV, or when you are doing your home videos. But why is not recommended in professional film world? Because it doesn't tell you anything about the rest of the tones in your image. You will simply know that probably part of your subject face is correctly exposed, but you'll have absolutely no clue about the shadows or about the other tonalities in your image. Other professional cameras will offer you a second Zebra. So before you have Zebra 1 and Zebra 2, and Zebra 2 you can set it to 100 IRE or 110 to prevent clipping the highlights. So that will give you an alert that the highlights are blown out or they are correctly exposed, but then again it will tell you nothing about the shadows. And we all know that cinematography is actually the art of placing the shadows in your images. Forget about the highlights. Back in the days of film era, the highlights were very difficult to clip, especially if you are using a color negative film. It's not that I've shot with that, I read about it, but that's why the filmic look always has the highlights very well exposed, because it was very difficult to blow them up when you are capturing an image. When you shoot film, the problem is that you need plenty of light to expose the shadows correctly. Now in digital era, and we are using today only digital camera most likely, or most of the time, unfortunately is the opposite. The highlights will be very easily clipped and very hard, so it's very easy to blow up the highlights, while the shadows can be easily recorded, sometimes by paying the price of the noise, but still any non-linear editor will be able to recover shadow to some extent. But highlights, once they are clipped, is very difficult to bring them back, or in other words, it's actually impossible. So this is where the second tool that we have in our arsenal comes into play, and this is the waveform. Now, a waveform is nothing but a graph, and it doesn't take into consideration, obviously, the camera sensor, the camera brand, the gamma curve, nothing. It's just an oscilloscope that will tell you on the horizontal axis, it shows you the image that you have framed with your camera. So what is left in the vertical scope is exactly what is left in the image. What is right is what is right. But on the vertical axis, that goes from 0 to 100, if your image is shot in 8-bit, or from 0 to 1024, if it's shot in 10 bits, that will show you the brightness of the pixels that are in your composition. But not, obviously not all the time what is on top is on top, and what is on bottom is on bottom. That means if I have a dark hat on my head, that will be rendered on the vector scope at the bottom of the image, because this is where the dark pixels, the dark tones are happening. Similarly, if somebody is wearing white shoes, let's say, and you are taking a full body shot of that person, those white shoes will be actually rendered at the top of the image, exactly where the person is framed on the horizontal axis. So this is something that you have to understand and you have to remember. Now I have activated the waveform monitor in my camcorder, and you can see all the settings that I'm using that are not very important. You can figure it out later on, but you can see here in the right bottom corner, anyway, in this area here, this is the waveform. And as I said, what you are seeing on the horizontal axis is exactly the image that I have framed exactly from left to right. But what you are seeing on the vertical axis is the brightness of the image. So if you pay attention here in the background where this lamp is, the brightness of the lamp will be represented here on the waveform in this area. So as you can see, I made it in such a way that it almost reached 100 IRE on the brightness scale, because this is what I wanted to place. That was an artistic decision. So the way I have taken this shot, just for you to understand better how I use the waveform, first of all, I turn off the lights in the room. I have set the white balance to 5600, which is daylight, and I locked it there because the light that I'm using is daylight. And then I turn on that practical. Now obviously the next logical step was to know what stop of light I wanted to use, what's the aperture that I wanted to use. And as you can see, there is f2. Now unfortunately I'm shooting with a camcorder, so that won't give me a blur background because the sensor is very small, and to benefit from a blurry background you need at least a Super 35, maybe a Micro Four Thirds. But the sensor that it is in this camera is very small, so at any aperture it will have a very big depth of field. But anyway, the light that comes, it's exactly in the same amount of it will happen if I will shoot with a full frame camera. So I decided to shoot at f2 because that will give me plenty of light. And obviously the practical in the background was blown out. Now with my own eyes I see that was correctly exposed, obviously, but for the camera that was blown out. And how I realized that is the waveform was spiking over the 100 IRE. So because everything else was locked, gain, shutter speed and aperture, the only way to control this was to put an ND filter, which came with my camera, and use this to control the exposure, because I did not have a dimmer or an ND filter to put over the practical. So just for teaching purposes, if I'm going to turn off the ND filter, as you can see, the waveform changed and the practical here in the background is now completely blown out. But if I turn on the ND filter again, which I have set it to 1f4, the waveform is now coming down to much more friendly values. Similarly, I did with the light that is illuminating my face. So similarly, if I'll be to dim the light, now as you can see, the waveform changes, and my face, which is here, because you can see it in the waveform, if I'm moving my head, you can see exactly how the waveform is moving, where my head is. This is completely underexposed. This should be above middle gray, maybe 50 IRE or 60, depends on the gamma curve that you are using. So to bring my face into the correct exposure, I have to increase the intensity of the light, and I was doing that progressively until I was happy with the value of the IRE that is offered by the waveform. So let me do that for you. So if I'm coming back with my light is I bring it back to 71%, now you can see that the waveform changes as well, and where my face is in the frame, now you can see that it's correctly exposed based on the gamma curve that I'm using. But also, in a glimpse, you can take exposure information about the rest of the shot. So you can also appreciate the IRE on the shadow area of my face. You can see what is the difference between the IRE value from the highlight of this side of the face and the shadows of there. And you can also compare this with the practical in the background, and you can also compare with the other shadows that you have in the frame, so you'll know exactly what is the ratio between your subject and your background. And if you're not happy, you can simply add more light or subtract, reading the result over the waveform. I think it's one of the best tools. The only one that surpasses it is the false color display, and I have made another video about it. You can check it at some stage as well. So just to conclude this video, waveform is a very specific tool that will help you and get the correct exposure all the time. On the horizontal axis, you're going to have what you have framed in your image, and on the vertical axis, you're just going to get the brightness of the pixels in your image that you have composed. Now, this is a primary tool that you use to acquire the correct exposure. The same tool, the same waveform you're going to find in your non-linear editor, and this will work in the same way. But unfortunately, once the image has been captured, there's very little that you can do after that in post, especially when the exposure is wrong. Either it's too much light on the sensor, or too little, or very little light hits the sensor. Again, you can increase the dynamic range of your sensor up until a limit by changing its gamma curve if your camera offers you that. Ideally, you should shoot in a log gamma curve, because that will unlock the whole potential of your sensor. Camera who does not have such a gamma curve, then you are forced to use the Rec 709, which is a much more limited gamma curve that offers you maybe 6 or even 5 stops of light, compared to a low gamma curve that can go up to 13 or 15, depends on the brand. And you don't have to despair It's just that you will need to balance the exposure using additional lights. Unfortunately, this is not always practical, but in films that we are doing in film school, this is always the answer, because it's very rare we'll be shooting a film without additional light sources. So I hope that was clear, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.